Christine Leach. And I don't spell it the Scottish way, I'm afraid. I spell it the English way, Leach. Well, it was my responsibility to write the story of the Beaton boys, of the Beatons themselves. I didn't feel I was actually properly equipped to do the background history of Scotland, which I felt was necessary. Well, we all felt was necessary in the book. So Andrea took that on.
I'm Andrea Cameron and I'm an archivist, and I first met Christine in 2016. She had some documents that were related to Northumberland, so I came up to collect the documents and met her, and we just hit it off from that point onwards, and we did a few little history things relating to Kintra and Penigale and finished those, and then we were wondering what can we do together that's related to local history. And Christine said, oh, you know, there's the Beatons from down the road and there's a cross, and they were medical men, and I hadn't heard of them at that point, and it sounded really exciting. And then the more we talked about it, the more I realised they were related to the Lords of the Isles, which is part of Scottish history I really love, and that kind of got me hooked. And then the two of us started working initially on an exhibition to do in Penigale Hall. That was unfortunately cancelled due to COVID. And then it kind of morphed into a book.
During the first part of the lockdown, I decided that I needed to do something useful. Yeah. I digitised the catalogue of everything in here so that when I popped my clogs, it would all be on the computer. And that was a long job. And I also finished off some transcription. But once I'd done both of those things, I didn't have a project on hand. And I hate it when I haven't got anything on hand. And because everybody else was locked down, there was nothing coming in.
Yeah.
And I think that's when
But I think you started to write the book. I think probably the Beaton section of it. Because I remember you sending me quite a big transcript that you'd written.
I'd written quite a bit.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think at that point I hadn't written the history section, you know, I'd just done the exhibition. And we were both scouting about thinking, how are we going to write about the medicine in more detail? Because we had it fairly briefly in the exhibition.
That's right, yes, it was still in exhibition form, wasn't it?
My name is Mieke Swamborn and I'm a writer and an artist. I came in in the middle of the whole process when Christine and Andrea were thinking about making an exhibition of the project. Because of that, I was asked, and then also because of my interest in seaweed, which probably is also been used by the Beaton doctors for their treatments. So then I wrote just a little piece about seaweed as a medicine, and I did a few illustrations of the legends that are still left, very funny wee stories.
It was you who introduced us to Liz, wasn't it?
No, Judy Gibson.
Well, through you.
Okay, yeah.
My name's Elizabeth Carter. I'm a gardener at Bolton Castle. This is my 8th year gardening up there, and my other hat is as a therapist. So the combination of the two is just wonderful, because I'm passionate about both, and to be able to balance that really intense one-to-one contact with somebody who's in distress, and then have hands in the soil on my own, you know, up on the hillside, it's a perfect combination for rebooting myself and regrounding myself. I happened to be on Erid, where I used to live for a year in 1990, stopping at the Croft with my friend Judy. I happened to get the tour bus, so it had a commentary. The driver had left the commentary on, and I'd never heard a commentary going down Mull before. And it said, you know, in 200 metres on the right, you'll see a cross, and a derelict cross for the Beatons, you know, medieval physician. And I'm thinking, what, medieval physicians, herb garden, what? Why do I not know about this? This is ridiculous. I've been coming here for years and I know nothing about this.
Did you know her?
No, not really. I think I've seen Liz once at the sheep roundup on Erith when she was staying with Judy, and I think it really was Judy's like suddenly very clear idea to ask her, because she has so much knowledge about herbs, but also about plants that were grown in medieval places, like a castle.
So I said, well, if I can be of any help to the group, I've done a lot of research about medieval herbs and, at the castle. And so that's how I got involved. So who are the Beatons? Well, that's a really good question.
The Beatons were a dynasty of medical men.
Before I got involved with it, I'd heard of them. In fact, weirdly, I'd heard a mention of the Beaton on Outlander. And I thought, oh, herbalist, she's a Beaton, what's that mean? So I'd looked it up, you see.
I'd never heard of them before, and I think a lot of people don't really realise who they are. And, they were quite prominent in their time. They served the Lords of the Isles, they became part of the Scottish Royal Court. I think it's really interesting because they trained in Europe. They were medically trained in Europe, so they weren't just the local herbalist. They wrote the manuscripts in Latin and Gaelic and came back here and practiced medicine here. And I just think it's an untold story.
I knew very, very little about it. And then suddenly I meet Christine, who's this absolute wealth of knowledge. And suddenly I'm in touch with a world of mystery and intrigue and wonder and history and these amazing physicians and their journey. I was hooked, absolutely hooked.
Our Beatons, the ones that the branch that ended up here, started in Ireland. The medical dynasty is big, and we've just got a little microscopic portion of their story in Pennycross. I mean, Bannerman did this wonderful book, what we use as our Bible, basically, just called The Beatons, and he looks at them in far greater detail. But because we knew that we'd actually got some of them here on the island, and not just that, they were next door.
There's the cross and the garden.
And the Port Naberlin as well, which is another clue to their existence. Oh, the rumour about the garden at Scour.
There's the garden at the Vague. There's the link with Duet Castle, because of the MacLeans and the fact that the Beatons would have been there with the MacLains.
Yes.
Like the
the Beaton Oak.
Garden,
Yes,
like
of course.
The wall and the oak.
Yes, the oak tree.
Seeing the remains of the garden now and just reimagining what that must have been like in its heyday is, my imagination goes wild.
Christine told me that even after the Second World War, people were not really allowed to go in the garden because of the poisonous plants.
I'm quite surprised how big these stones are. I suppose it shows how important they were. To think manhandling them in those days.
Well, they would have had tripods or other ways of maybe slippery seaweed to roll them uphill.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose...
Because there's evidence that they did that also with standing stones, rolling them over a lane of seaweed.
Also, I suppose if you were quarrying them locally, it's easier to quarry the big bits, isn't it? You've either got lots of work in the quarry to make small bits, that are easier to carry, or you've got easier work in the quarry and then these big bits to carry, haven't you? It's amazing to think how many things have lived in and around this tree.
I think in an oak, more than 700 species can live on the bark.
Yeah.
A lot of the herbs were classed as cure-alls because they were often used for many different things. I have some personal favourites. Lungwort, just because it flowers for such a long time, but it was also tied in with the doctrine of signatures. So the doctrine of signatures was a very early form of how physicians identify what a plant was for. So we're going back a long time. So they believed that God had given each plant a unique signature that would guide the physician or the healer or the wise woman to know what that plant was for. So lungwort, with its spotty leaf, was used for lung disease. And it was called lungwort because wort is the old name for any medicinal plant. So lungwort was for diseased lungs and is still used for respiratory problems today.
Oh, wood anemone, look.
Oh yeah. Is that the wood sorrel? Yeah. That's also nice.
Yeah. What, to eat?
Mm-hmm. Very refreshing. Oh, and
Bluebells, yeah.
coming up already.
Henbane, which I haven't included because I'd have been burnt as a witch, I'm sure, because anybody found with henbane, it was very dodgy. It could create hallucinations. It was in lots of witches' spells, but it was also a very good sedative and a painkiller, so that it's very strong. It's poisonous, so they would soak rags in henbane water and then wrap it round a tooth for toothache to numb the pain. Sweet woodruff, that's beautiful. That was used on the battlefield for wounds. The grimony's a good one. That was used for wounds. It was one of the most famous vulnerary herbs, but it was also used for pain. And if you put a sprig of a grimony under your pillow, it would help you sleep. The only trouble is that you wouldn't wake up until somebody removed it. It just goes on and on and on, really. I know at the castle, what I've done is I've divided it up into things like digestive, respiratory, wounds, anti-inflammatory, etc. So that even though, as I said, a number of the herbs were cure-alls in that they'd be used for a load of different conditions, I suppose I had to try and narrow it down, to give somebody an idea as to what they'd be used for. So I tried to pin it down, but at the same time, the disclaimer is a lot of them were used for multiple purposes.
I've been very lucky here because Jo Curry, who wrote Mull, the Island and Its People, she had given me access to all her research material, including masses of stuff from the Lochbuie papers and other sources, but particularly the Lochbuie papers, and going through those, extracting material for all the different farms in this area. I came across stuff to do with the Beatons. And then I got in touch with Argyll Archives, and suddenly I was finding all sorts of bits of information which I had no idea about beforehand, and the story began to build up. And then, of course, we found out about the manuscripts, and that just blew our socks off. This is part of the genealogy of the family of the Beatons. It's quite difficult to follow, actually. I wish they'd have done it the right way up. Our family is this one. They go from the latest person up to the earliest. There's the Fergus, son of Donald, son of Malcolm, which is that bit, Malacolm or something, son of Gilanders or Andrew, and then son of Domnall there, and then son of Fergus. So we had a Fergus at Pennycross as well as they did at Dervick.
And this comes out of here, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so this is the Lang manuscript.
Yep.
And this is the only one that's in Edinburgh University. All the rest are in the what used to be the Advocates' Library. But I mean, that binding, it's so beautiful,
Isn't it?
So
that's a bit of
recipes of medicines in here and treatments, or what is written in there?
Without actually looking it up again, I can't remember.
But I think
because
that
it would be a compendium of all sorts of
this
things.
one's a bit of a collection with some
It-
beaten
it-
stuff in.
It would have been.
Whereas
yes,
this
absolutely.
one belonged to
Yeah.
the Beatons, and was written by the Beatons, But it's really
So-
interesting because they actually talk about the different hands as well
Yes.
throughout the manuscript, so you
Yes.
can see who's written what
Yes, and how many of them
Yeah.
were Pennycross Beatons. And then, of course, it transpired that it wasn't just their names, these actually were their manuscripts.
Yeah,
It might well have been written out by them, yes. Yes.
in Gaelic and Latin.
Yes.
And this is the one that they attached to the belt
Yeah, so-
and walked
Was
around
always
with. Yeah.
them, yeah.
Yeah, I love the fact that they say it was remarkably small and chubby was how it was described. Yes, and it had in with it something which they could use for divine office, so that the physician was taking the part of being a religious doctor as well. And so he'd have a bit of Psalm 118 together with his medical notes. The reason I like this one is because it's meant to be in English. Well, I mean, it is in English, but it's an English that I can't read, except that every now and again you come across something, and it's usually
Plant names, isn't
plant
it?
names, yes.
So wormwood,
Wormwood, mugwort,
chamomile,
yeah. Pennyroyal,
pennyroyal, yeah.
saffron. Is that saffron?
Oh, yeah, saffron.
What's that there? That water of...
Neptune. I don't know. More mugwort.
Yeah. And then that's
Brownie.
brownie.
Bryony, yes. And cyclamen. I find that interesting because cyclamen isn't a native plant of Mull, so that must have been introduced very early on. Because if this was written in the 1600s or something, they must have brought an awful lot back from the continent, you know, when they were...
Well, there was a fair trade went on, wasn't there?
Yeah, yeah. And when they were studying, they probably...
Is that Artemisia and
Oh,
cinnamon?
yes, it probably
Yeah.
is, isn't it? Yeah. And cinnamon.
And balm.
Balm, yeah.
The fact that 25 of these volumes, which had all been stitched together, had actually survived over all these centuries, while I still, you know, it's like picking up a bit of Roman pottery and finding a thumbprint of a Roman. I found it that exciting that these manuscripts had been used by our Beatons. It's lovely.
So this is called Port na Berlin, harbour of the Berlin boats. Trying to imagine the Beatons sailing into Loch Screeden and seeing the Beaton cross there at the hill as an important landmark to aim for, and then landing here and walking along the path. The path is also still quite more visible than you would expect.
So where's the cross from here?
The cross is
Over there? Because I bet,
a
you
bit
know,
to
when
the
these trees were young, you could easily see it from here.
Yeah.
And if you think when they weren't there, you could see any ships approaching along here.
Yeah, but I think also all the hazel and that is now like the cross is now surrounded by that. That mustn't
Yeah.
be there.
I think that it was Archibald, the fourth MacLean, who actually put the plinth up.
It must have been during the 1990s that I became aware of the cross. And at that time, Ian Moody was manager of the Pennygale estate. And so because the cross is actually on the estate, he sort of had an overall responsibility to look after it. But it was never anything that was written down. It was always something that was just understood. And if he hadn't done it, no one would have known and no one would have bothered either. So he started the ball rolling, really. And Lynn Harris, who was working for the estate too at the same time, I mean, she took an interest in it as well. There were other volunteers from the area as well. Bob Hasty, he did the walkway eventually. I don't know who it was, but someone began to notice that the access was just plain difficult. It was boggy, it was all overgrown. No one knew it was there, so no one cleared a proper track to it. And then the cross itself, they noticed that it was just beginning to lean slightly.
So we went down and had a look. And sure enough, I mean, it wasn't just that there were baby sycamores growing out everywhere. The railings looked in a really bad condition. It was a bit of a fight to get through there to start with. And then we realised that the cross itself, the shaft, was wonky. It wasn't actually standing up straight.
We followed the example of the Ross of Mull Historical Centre and what they did for Kilvacuan burial ground.
So we went to a doctor monument. I got Dr. Bob, as we call him, Bob Allen, to actually be in charge of the process. And we went through a doctor monument and they were brilliant. They took on all the difficult bits, like raising the money and who to go to get all the details. It was a long business. It took nearly 2 years, but eventually, just before COVID, it all came through and we'd got the area towards the cross sorted out so that we had a boardwalk going up to it, and we got an interpretation board,
so that the public knew what they were coming to and knew what the cross was and all the rest of it.
Oh, and then we got the A-frame put up. Richard Hallam from Greben keeps it clear during the year, and he makes sure as well that the railings are in good order.
This is one of the ore wheats. So they would burn this and use the ashes to treat injuries or inflammations by rubbing it into open wounds. It grows year round and it's very easy to dry, so it must have been quite easy to take it en route or also to dry it for later or to collect it immediately when it was needed. And there's so many good qualities in it. There's so much nutrition and ways you can use the different seaweed. You can treat it for wounds. You can treat it like, for example, the sea lettuce helps against headache. You would just put it on your front head, and then it takes away pain. It makes you it brings you asleep. There's some recent research that it maybe also could help against dementia. And there's so many different seaweeds for a specific treatment. So, for example, the dulse would have helped women at delivery, so they would rub their bellies with fresh dulse, and I think the fresher the better. I read that people on the islands for a long time they always had a little bit in their pocket just to nibble on it, or when they felt a bit tired, or when they needed a little bit like a snack, they could use that. This is very nice one to wrap a fish in it and to put it with a coat of seaweed in the oven for 50 minutes, and then you get a delicious steamed fish. And it's a bit the salt from the seaweed comes in, and then the seaweed gets crispy as well, so you can eat it next to the fish. Some of this pink paint and coral weed, which would help against worms, and I think it was also a treatment against diarrhea. Oh, and broken legs. I think every little bit of history that can be seen by some traces in the landscape, or as a story, or just in your imagination, helps you to connect to that landscape. Every time I drive here through the glen, and then you come to Pennygale and Pennygross, I almost like meet these doctors, because when you know a little bit of the history, it activates a little bit of the landscape, and in a way like links you to the history. Yeah, it's a good start as you are new to a place like me. All these stones must be touched by the Beatons, or some of them at least.
The fact that the Beatons were traditionally trained at that time, so they'd been to those universities, they knew the history of medicine, they knew all that background, and yet, so there'd be the trepanning and all the gruesome stuff, but alongside that was this absolute basic understanding of plants and their place in medicine, which of course they were combining with other things. I mean, they have to be at the absolute forefront of Scottish medicine, for me.